Hi everyone, welcome back to Giphy Day 2. So the first thing you want to make sure that you do is to make sure that you have that JSON view extension downloaded. And so we did this last class, but once again, if you need a refresher, you're going to make sure that this is downloaded. And when it is downloaded, you should have this little circle at the top of your browser that says JSON view. Make sure that's done, or else you're not going to be able to do the rest of this project. So we are going to get started on this do now. And this do now is a pretty interesting one. Reason being, it's about Pokemon. And we are going to be making sure that when we click on this button, certain information comes up. And what we are going to be doing to do that is querying a Pokemon API called Poke API. And so we are going to look into this API endpoint, and we need to make sure that we reformat this. This is a lot of data that this Poke API has sent us, and we're going to reformat it using this JSON view extension. And after a second, you're going to see that it is in a much more readable format. There you go. And so remember that this entire thing that is sent over is a massive object that we as coders need to parse through to get the information that we want. The question here is, can we determine which Pokemon the return data is about? So this is assuming that you know Pokemon, but if we look at this Pokemon, you will notice that we have some information about it. We know its abilities through this object. We know it has a lot of different forms, or we have its forms. We know its game indices. We scroll down, we know its height, we know its items, we know its ID. I actually think that if you scroll down enough, you might be able to find, so right now we are looking through various objects with its moves that it learns. So for example, headbutt is a move that it learns. Scroll all the way down. There is a lot of data to parse through here. I wonder if, interesting. Its weight is all the way down here. Its type is down here. I can actually use a couple of these too. Oh, here it is. This is Bulbasaur, and we had to scroll down a lot to figure out that information, but all of this is information about Bulbasaur and the different types of information that we might need to use. Yeah, so let's get started. We are going to build a Pokédex entry. And so the example that we have that's already written for us is that we are going to use the .html action to display the Pokemon's name in the div with class name. So we are going to, in the div with class name, line 13 in our HTML, the div with the class name, we're going to look at what code is already written for us. And this is the example. Remember here that we have declared a variable with an API URL, and we've stored it in this variable called URL. And in our click function, the first thing we are going to do is fetch the data from this URL and wait for that response, and then do something with that data. And so notice that we already have a console.log there. And so if we open up our console and we click on this button, you'll actually see all of that object data in our console, but we do not find that usable. And so we need to just figure out which aspects of that data, which elements we need to display. And so you'll also notice that here in that div with the class name, we have already taken that name property from our Poke data. And so that name property is up here. You will notice that Bulbasaur appears at the top of our screen. And so the next thing we want to do is we want to display the Pokemon's weight in the div with class weight. And so this is instruction number 1. You'll notice that this .html action is already written for us, and that .weight is a class. Let's look for that. .weight is a class of our div, and our Pokemon oh, it says with, but Pokemon weight needs to replace this text right here. And what that looks like is looking in our object for that weight data. And we actually found it at the very, very end. And so what we will do here is we are going to type in our object's name, and we are going to grab that weight property. And let's close our console so that when we click, I'm gonna actually open this up. When we click, two things happen. Bulbasaur appears at the very top, and our Pokemon's weight appears here, and it has replaced the text that was already there because that's what .html does. So now we are actually going to do the same thing with the Pokemon's height, and that is the div with the class height we will be appending. Let's make sure that our code is super clean. All right. Height.html. And what we are appending to this div with the class height is that height data. And so let's look into our API data again. One nice thing about this is if you press Control F, you might actually be able to find that height data. And so the height of this particular Pokemon, Bulbasaur, is 7. So in order to retrieve that key, we need to name that property. And so that property actually is just very simply a property of this main object. And so height, so PokeData is our main object, and we are just grabbing that height data. We press I choose you. You'll notice that our height is there, our weight is there, and the name is there. So I'm gonna go through and just do this next one. Display the Pokemon's type in the div with class type. And if the Pokemon has more than one type, display just one. And this is a little bit where it gets tricky. I'm going to just go ahead and type in our code. Let's look for the type information. And so I'm just gonna go ahead and search type. And you'll see that types is a property within our data, within our object data. So types is a property within our objects data. I'm gonna type in Pokemon data.types. But you'll actually notice that when I press I choose you, nothing shows up when we just very simply name that property .types. And the reason why is because types itself is an object. It's not a very simple, like weight, it has a property and a key. It's a very, very simple property and key. But types itself is an object. So we need to make sure that we are calling that name of the type. And so types 0 is this object here, and types 1 is this object here. And so whichever one we choose, we need to say types 0. And so I choose you, and still nothing appears, right? Because within types 0, there is another step that we need to take. Slot is the first property within type 0. And so you'll notice that if I type in type0.slot, 1 appears. The reason is 1 is the key of this property slot. So type 0 slot gives us this key 1. Type 0 type is another option that we can take. So if we just type in type there and we press I choose you, still nothing appears because type itself is an array. And so this array has two properties. It has name as its first property, and it has URL as its second. And so if we just want grass to appear, we actually have to name that. So type name, and that's a little bit tricky. I suggest that when you type that out, you go into that JSON object response and sort of see how all of this relates to this object right here named types, right? So we named type 0, and then we went into the type array within this bigger object, And then we named that first property name for grass to appear, right? And now we want to display the Pokemon's image. And so the Pokemon's image, we need to look for that div with the class pick. And it says here that we need to find that word sprites. And sprites is actually where you're going to find the image. This div with the class pick already has within it an image with a picture of a Pokeball. What we're going to do is we're going to replace it. So within that div, we're going to replace all of the HTML in there. And remember, we're going to need to do some of that string interpolation here. I'm just going to go ahead and create an empty image tag. And so when we press I choose you, an empty image tag appears, but we need to fill that image with something, right? And so that empty image tag will be filled with some jQuery action. And so if we Google sprites here, you'll notice that sprites has a couple of different properties. We have some back default. We can actually click into this. This is the Bulbasaur's back. For a Pokédex entry, I think that we would want to do like a front picture. So let me go back to that property sprites. Let's do like a front default picture, right? So how we can access this property within sprites. Sprites is a property within the bigger object. So let's start there. That bigger object is called PokeData. And then we want to access sprites, which is a property within PokeData. And then we want to name what it is that we are trying to access. So sprites has a couple of properties. Let's do front default and see what happens. Dot front default. And when we open this up, if we click I choose you, Bulbasaur appears, grass, the height, the weight, and the image. And that is how we query the API, this massive API that this Poke API sent back, or this massive object that this Poke API sent back is going to give us the information that we need. Very, very cool. So what you will also notice, is a couple of things. That within this do now, or you will notice that within this Poke API, there is a number 1, but we could actually change it, change that information to find some other really cool information. So Bulbasaur was number 1, but 49 is actually a different Pokemon. I don't have my Pokédex memorized, but Pokemon, this number 9 is a different Pokemon. It knows different attacks and it knows different moves from Bulbasaur. Let's see, not quite sure. We could probably also just query the API with our do now. We'll go ahead and do that later. Cool, so I'm gonna go ahead and present. Yeah, you'll notice that Dragonite is a different Pokemon, and we can actually look at that later. So today what you're going to be doing is you are going to be identifying parts of an API request URL and be able to customize it using user input. And so we've actually just noticed that if we change that number here, when we query the API, we'll actually get a lot of different types of information about different Pokemon. And so here's Jolteon here, who is number 145. And here's Mew, who is number 151. And all of them have different information from Bulbasaur. Our Poke API actually will search our URL and bring back the information that we want. So this is an example of the API request to Giphy API we've already been using. And so for our project day 1, you use this API URL to request information about this very specific thing from Giphy. So this API tells us what we are using, right? So there you go. And this part tells us what part of the API we are using. And here we'll be searching stickers. We will be searching the GIFs. Q is the search term. Rating is PG. It searches for the GIF's rating. And this API key is actually very special. It's used to access the API. And so APIs take parameters, so we can tell it what we are searching for. And so how do we know what our request is supposed to look like? There is actually Giphy documentation that will help you out with that. And so this Giphy documentation will allow you to search what kind of content you're able to search through when accessing the API, as well as like different API endpoints. So let's look at random ID endpoints. And so notice that it helps you to customize your URL just based on what you want to look for. So you can look into that a little bit later, the API documentation. So what is the search term in the API request URL that we've been using for our projects? What is the search term? And what do we need to change so that our project returns whatever the user searches for? All right, so awesome. So if we want to change what the user is searching for, we just need to change that search term puppy, right? We can change it to whatever we want. And so there's a couple of examples here. We can change what type of data we get back by changing the value we are passing to the query. And so we can actually access these links here and notice that these will return very different responses. So if we paste that first link, use JSON view, it's going to parse through all of this. You will notice that this API URL with the search term hello brings back this information. But if we do a API request with this search term, with the search term city, it's going to bring back a whole different set of information. Right, and so notice that it's just this Q equals that term that can be switched in order for Giphy to return back a whole different set of responses. Right, and so we're going to do a really quick review of click handlers, which you've been seeing a lot of. We set up a jQuery click handler so that when the user presses the button, our code springs into action. So when we click on the button, we're going to make things happen. Right? We can use jQuery to retrieve the value of the input and have it appear in text. So if we want our user to be able to search something, we need to make sure that we save that input, we retrieve it with .val, and we store it inside this variable. So I call this variable search term. So that's the first thing that needs to happen in our click function. We can also use concatenation to add the value of the input into our API request URL. So here is this API URL input that should look familiar, but we are using string concatenation to edit that search term. So that search term comes from that variable. So whatever the user searches, it stores it in this variable, and then it utilizes this variable to update the API URL. Pretty cool. Right? So when we put it together, like I said, it uses the search term, and it uses that search term to update that API URL, and that API URL is stored in new URL. And so you can see how easily customizable this is based on the user's input. All right, so let's work together on this 6.2 guided practice in Popcode. We're going to be customizing an API URL based on a user's input. So let's click into it. I'm going to close a couple of our windows. All right, so you will notice here that we have a TV show finder with an input box. A TV show I have been watching a lot is The Great British Baking Show. So if I click on this button, something happens, but it's not exactly what I'm expecting, right? And we will actually notice a couple of things. So the first thing we need to do is just look at the code that already exists. We have a click handler with a button. And we actually have in our HTML a div, or no div, just this image is appearing in the body. So let's analyze our code just to see what's happening. Our current API URL is this TV Maze API, And you will actually see that the search function is set to Riverdale, right? And so that's why no matter what it is that I search, I want to look up Vampire Diaries, that Riverdale image is still going to show up, that Riverdale image. And so what we want to do today is we just want to customize this URL using the information that using the lesson that we've just learned. So let's continue to analyze our code. We have that fetch of that URL, and so that Riverdale API is going to always be fetched. That response from that Riverdale API is going to be returned, and we can use this data. We'll use this data to save the pick URL in this function. So let's make sure that we totally get this. I'm going to close these instructions really quickly. So within this function, we are retrieving this data and we are creating a variable called pick URL. And this data right here is going to be saved in pick URL. I'm actually going to copy and paste this into our JSON. And so what's happening here is that TV data 0, which is this very first object, which is actually the only object within this object, TV data 0 dot show, that property, image, the second property. So within show, let's look for image. Here's image. And you'll notice that image, it's a object with two properties, medium and original. And what we've done is we've pulled that medium image. So from this very specific API URL that only shows Riverdale data, right? But what we want to do is we want to update the code so that we customize the request URL based on the user's input. So the first thing we're going to do is declare a variable that will store the inputs. I'm actually going to refresh this. I'm going to declare a variable. I'll call it search. And I am going to grab that input value. And let's make sure that we know what that input is. There is no class, there's no ID, it's just input. So it will be a element. Right, and so that's the first thing we're going to do. The next thing is we want this search, this input that is stored in this variable search to update this Riverdale API. So remember here that we need to delete that and we need to update with search. And it's telling us to use console.log to test our variable's contents. And so if I want to console.log search, and I want a console.log API URL, I will be able to see to make sure that my search function is working or my input function is working. And I will also be able to make sure that that API URL is updating based on our search. So if I want to do the Great British Baking Show, there we go. There is the console. There is the Great British Baking Show, which is what I typed in my input. And here is the updated URL with the Great British Baking Show within it. Right? And so that is a really, really awesome way to customize URLs. Notice that I didn't have to change too much about this. Actually, I didn't have to change anything about it. I was able to append the same image with the same format, and I was able to use the same properties in order to access that picture data that I want, that image data that I want. And so that is how you can do, you can customize your API URL and you can handle the response. And so let me look up another show. Let me just for fun, I'm gonna look at Pokemon. There we go. Awesome. And now what you're going to do is try this out for yourself in the independent practice. The independent practice will have you doing about the same thing. This is our do now. But what you are going to end up doing is you're going to update the code to customize the request URL based on the user's input. So we noticed that this number 1 here is what we need to customize. And so what you're going to do is when a user enters a Pokemon number, you're going to update this based on that number. All right. And so what we are going to do now is project time. By the end of your day 2, these are the couple of things that you need to make sure you finish. The first thing is you're going to update the API request URL based on the user's input, which we just did in the guided practice and what you did independently in your independent practice. And you're going to display a different GIF to the screen depending on the updated request URL. After that, you're going to make sure that you update that README file with your progress. And so another reminder to make sure that you are going through this README. Make sure that your day 1 stuff is done, and then move on to your day 2, which is, exactly the instructions that I just read, but make sure that you're updating that progress in your code. Good luck.